Good day, grade 12 learners. Welcome to today's history lesson. My name is Mr. Dixon. This lesson is brought to you by the Gauteng Department of Education in collaboration with Sabono Discovery Center. Today, learners, we will be dealing with question 4, paper 1. Take note, we are dealing with question 4, paper 1. It is part and parcel of topic 3. Now, remember we started off with topic 1, which is basically the Cold War. Then we were dealing with the origins of the Cold War, and then we dealt with Vietnam as an essay at the same time. So today we are starting basically with Black Power, and it is part of topic 3 basically. Take note that we have dealt with already with the Civil Rights Movement, and the Civil Rights Movement pertained to Martin Luther King. And today we will be focusing on the Black Power movement. Now, please take note, before we start off with anything, we will be dealing with what we call the cognitive levels of how you should basically answer an essay. What is basically required to answer an essay? Now, it is pertinent that we understand that when answering any essay type question, it's important that we understand the different types of questions that will be posed to, but we will be dealing with that as we go along. But let us quickly look at the requirements before we start. Now, take note, we will be dealing with the requirements, how you should answer an essay, what should be in the essay. Then we will be dealing with the introduction, how the introduction should look like. We'll be basically talking about the background paragraphs. We'll be talking about the content paragraphs. At the same time, we will be dealing with examples of how a proper introduction should be written, how a proper conclusion should be written, and we will be also dealing pertaining to the Peel method within itself. Now, let's start off. What is required when answering a proper essay question? Essay questions require every learner that answers a question to take a stance. That's the first thing. So we need to understand, where do we take our stance? We take our stance where? In the introduction paragraph. Take note, in the introduction paragraph, we take our stance. Then from there onwards, what do? We develop a relevant and coherent line of argument. Now, learners, when we will be dealing with the introduction, it is imperative that we understand that how do we develop a relevant and coherent line of argument. Now, that's where most of the learners get confused, basically. So it means now learners are struggling to develop that. It means to maintain the line of argument that you created with in your introduction. And this is why it is so pertinent that we take a stance. Then, what is the line of argument? The line of argument must be supported with a relevant historical evidence. That is pertinent that we understand. It must be supported by relevant historical evidence. Now, let me just stop there a little bit. When we talk about historical evidence, it means now you cannot write your own ideas. You cannot write your own perception pertaining to what the question is asking you to do. So it's pertinent that we understand, learners, that when we talk about historical evidence, we need to talk about facts. We need to talk about work that has been dealt with your educator. Because if we do not deal with that, it clearly indicates unto us learners that you are writing from your own understanding. So this is why it is pertinent that your education, your educator provides you with the necessary information, the necessary material in order for you to maintain that line of argument. Then let's continue. And why do we need that line of argument? We need that line of argument in order for us to organize and to connect chronologically to the question being posed. And this is the ultimate thing here. If there is no historical evidence, it becomes a bit difficult. So when we talk about historical evidence, we're talking about facts. We're not talking about your own ideas, your own knowledge that you have inquired, what you think the answer should be. And this is what happens here, is that sometimes learners rewrite the sources. Now, when you do that, when you rewrite the sources, you will basically receive a mark allocation of presentation 1, content 1, and that will give you 0 out of 50. So it means now you cannot copy the sources. You need to create a line of argument through what? Through providing us with historical evidence. And how do you get that information? You get that information by studying. It means after you have done the essay with your educator at school, you need to go home and you need to work through the essay, and you need to you need to use old questions, and you need to work through them and create your own line of argument. So when any question is being asked, you will be able to answer that, and you need to organize it, and you need to connect it chronologically. So when we talk about chronologically, what is it to be? What is chronological? Chronological means A, B, C, D. Now let me use numbers. Chronological means 1, 2, 3, 4. You cannot say 4, then you go to 1. It means you can't mix your paragraphs up and down. It means there must be, now the first paragraph must be 1, the second one must be 2, 3. You can't mix it around, because the minute you begin to do that, your essay becomes flawed. Now let's quickly go into the 3 ways how essay questions will be set up. What happens is, this is not in the chronological order how it will be in the question paper or the SBA or the June examination or the prelim examination. These questions are just placed on the screen randomly. So don't think that the first question will always be critically discussed. The second one will be, do you agree? The third one, explain to what extent. No, 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 no. I'm just using it like this in order for you to gain an understanding. Now, please take note. Paper one, the reason why I'm talking about paper one, so that you can begin to familiarize yourself. When you look at paper one, question one, it's a Cold War, the origins of the Cold War. Question two, the source base is Angola. Question three, it is basically what we call the civil rights movement. Now, after you have seen those 3 source-based questions, now you go to section B. Section B is basically what we call the essay question. So question 4. So question 4 now would be basically Vietnam. Then as question 4 will be basically Vietnam, question 5 will be Congo, and this question that we're dealing with will be question 6. So we need to understand that this will be the order of the questions. Let me repeat again. Question 1, Cold War, the origin of the Cold War. Then question 2 will be Angola. Question 3, civil rights movement. Then when we go to section B, which is the essay will be what we call Vietnam. Then we will have Congo. Question 5, question 6 it's basically the essay that we are dealing with right now, and it's called Black Power movement. Now let's go into the questions first. How the questions will be posed to you. It says here, critically discuss, approve or disapprove. Now, when we talk about critically discuss, what happens is they always give a statement. And when they give a statement, then at the bottom of the statement, they will write critically discuss. So once you see critically discuss, now you know when you take your stance, now you say one can approve, one can disapprove. So it means now you need to use one can approve, one can disapprove, or it can be entrusted. By saying it can be entrusted, it means that you are saying yes, you are for what the statement is giving you. So it's pertinent that we understand that when they say critically discuss, you can listen, your learners, you cannot say I, because why can't you say I? You are a historian and you need to take a neutral stance pertaining to the question being posed. Then the second one, do you agree with the above statement? So when we say do you agree with the above statement, take note, the statement is being posed, and as the statement is being posed, now the second question, now the second line comes, do you agree with the above statement? Now we elaborate pertaining to the particular topic that we are dealing with. Then the stance that you take is one can agree, one can disagree. You don't say I, because I means you are a historian, you need to take a neutral ground. If you say I, it means you are taking sides, and we are historians, so that is not allowed for us. Then the last one talks about explain to what extent. Now take note, you can say to a less or you can say to a greater extent, but take note, when it comes to a greater extent, you can say Now this is how the sentence needs to start: to a less extent, or you say to a less extent, or you say to a greater extent. Now take note, when it comes to a greater extent, you can say to a larger extent. Take note, you say to a lesser extent, or you say to a greater extent. But when you say to a greater extent, you can say to a larger extent. Now, these are the three types of ways how the questions will be posed to you. Now, take note. If you think back to grade 10, you think back to grade 11, yes, these type of questions were posed to you. So it means most of you are familiar with it, but maybe you did not understand about when it came to the stance. Now, we have provided wording that will assist you in order for you to create a proper stance. Now, let's quickly go into the introduction. The introduction should make it clear to anyone that's reading your essay, basically. Number one, what is the direct response to the question? Now take note, when we dealt with what are the requirements when answering a essay, the first thing that came along was you must take what? A stance. So it means now, what is the stance that you must take? Then we went to the second slide. The second slide, we dealt with the three questions: critically discuss, do you agree, to what extent? Now take note, learners, it must be clear. So your first line is your stance that you take. Very important, the stance that you take. We provided approve or disapprove. We indicated to you one can agree, one can disagree. We indicated to what extent also it can be provided to you. The number two, what is going to be discussed in the content. So it means now, number two is basically you are going to retrieve information from where? From the source. So when you retrieve information from the source, so what does that mean? It clearly means that you must know your content. And the content is what we talk about: historical information, historical evidence, basically. So where do we find what we are going to discuss about? And that is what we also call the reason, basically. We will go more into detail what is a proper introduction. Then number three, the line of argument that is going to be followed in the rest of the essay. It's important that we understand that the line of argument that is going to be followed in the rest of the essay. This is what the essay is going to prove to us, basically, if our stance was right that we took in the introduction, basically. Well, learners, if you read the first sentence of any paragraph of any long piece, and you cannot work out clearly what the original question was, then the introduction has failed in its primary purpose. So learners, it is imperative, it is pivotal that we understand that your introduction plays a vital role pertaining to any essay. Now, here's an example quickly how the essay should look like, basically. It says that we have provided a question for you. And the question is, explain to what extent Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael were successful in instilling black pride among African Americans in the 1960s. Use relevant examples to support your answer. Now take note, I indicated to you when they use critically discuss as a question, when they use do you agree, then they first provide a statement, then they say critically discuss, or they say do you agree. But to what extent, this is how the question will be posed to you. They first start with to what extent. Now take note, let's go to the answer that is being provided here. It says here, to a great extent, Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael were successful in instilling black pride among African Americans in the 1960s. Now, learners, what can you notice here? We took a stance. What is the stance that we took? We said to a great extent. So we cannot use the word to a great extent. One can agree. I'm repeating again. We cannot use the same wording. To a great extent, one can agree in the same sentence. Because why? What is the question asking us? The question is asking us to what extent. So you cannot use the word agree. You either say to a less or you either say to a greater extent. And here's the example that you can clearly see. Basically, we said to a great extent. Then we went back to the question. We said to a great extent, Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael were successful in instilling black pride amongst African Americans in the 1960s. So what did we do? We went back to the question, took from the question, and all that we did is we put in front, or you can put this at the end also. You can clearly say Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael were successful in instilling black pride amongst African Americans to a greater extent in the 1960s. So now we can clearly see, but your first sentence is your stance that you need to take. Now let's go to the second part. The second part is basically what we say, the reason. So you retrieve information from where? From the content. Now we will clearly see the red. Once we go through the content, we will clearly see that this was retrieved from the content. Now let's read it quickly. It says, it emphasized racial pride, economic empowerment, and the creation of political and cultural institutions. Now we can clearly see that how was black pride instilled in them through emphasizing racial pride, economic empowerment, and the creation of political and cultural institutions. Now, learners, we can clearly see that this is retrieved where? From the content within itself. Then we end off our introduction by saying the following paragraphs. Now, take note. Some learners might say it will be discussed in the essay how Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael instilled black pride in African Americans. But when we look at this one, this one is quite simplified. The following paragraphs will be explaining how Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael instilled black pride in African Americans. Now, learners, we can clearly see that, remember, the first slide before we dealt with, we spoke about 3 points. We spoke about the first one was your stance. The second one was your reason, what you are going to talk about. Then the third one is basically what you are going to inform us, how you are going to tackle this question. So we can clearly see now that yes, there are 3 sentences, but it can become 4. Why? Because sometimes the content, the reason that you are retrieving from the source can become 2 sentences at large also. So this is an example, learners, that you can use. You can practice it through, and after practicing it through, it will guide you how to write a proper introduction. Now, let's re-emphasize now again now. What is a proper introduction? Step 1, stance, and you refer to the question. I'm sure you are familiar with that now. You take your stance. After your stance, in the same sentence, you refer back to the question. Now you say, now take note. Now you say one can agree, one can disagree. Yes, I can see on the screen it's written to agree. Now it means you must say one can agree, one can disagree. And on the screen, you can clearly see that it says to a large extent, to a less extent. Now remember what we said. When you say to a greater extent, you can also say to a large extent. Then the second step is reason. Because when you say reason, because I'm writing this essay because of this and this and this and that. So we can clearly see that it spoke about the cultural institutions, it spoke about instilling black, but how did they do it? It's informing us how they did it basically. Then the last one is what we call step 3. Now, step 3 is what we call the orientation, provide historical evidence which content is going to be used. So now we inform us, listen here, I am going to talk about how Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael instilled pride in black Americans in the 1960s. So now this is a clear demonstration. So every individual, every learner can now see, listen here, here's the question. How should my introduction look like? Now take note, learners. Yes, you can have a good introduction. You can have all 3 phases. But if you don't have the content, your essay will be flawed basically. Now take note. Now after you have started your introduction, you are done with the introduction. Now you move into what we call background paragraphs. Now take note, I'm saying background paragraphs. I'm using the word plural, background paragraphs. Now, the background paragraphs creates a line of argument where we move on. It means It means that it creates a basis, it creates a foundation where we move on into the content. So when we talk about we are moving from one place to another place, yes, we have written down the introduction, so now we go into the background paragraph. So what does the background paragraph do? The background paragraph creates the foundation where we need to move into. Remember when we're dealing with Vietnam, we spoke about we spoke about introduction, and then we went to the background paragraph. When we spoke about the background paragraph, we spoke about the Geneva Conference. We spoke about the leader in the north, the leader in the south. We spoke about who are they supporting, and then we even mentioned to you guys about the National Liberation Front. So that was a clear background information. We even spoke about who provided the VETCON with, with the weapons, with the military aid. We even we even informed you why the VETCON was difficult to detect. So that is what we call the background pertaining to any essay. So it's important that we understand that, yes, the background paragraph creates a foundation where we need to move into the content basically. Now let's quickly go to the body. Now, please take note, when we talk about the body, learners, we are talking about the content, the body content, same thing, same thing. So now, what did we talk about here? We spoke about introduction, how the introduction should look like, the three things that's supposed to be, in the introduction. We spoke about the background paragraphs. Why is it so important to have background paragraphs? Now we're moving into the body. Now take note, the body contains all the relevant factual material, and that should be explicitly linked to the line of argument. It means now, when we talk about a line of argument, we're talking about the Peel method. We will be dealing with the Peel method soon. Then it should be well structured in a chronological and coherent manner, displaying good synthesizers of information. You must give examples to reinforce your stance that you took. Now take note, learners, when we talk about the content should have all relevant factual material, we need to understand your content paragraphs. Take note, your content paragraphs, it's not 1, 2. It could be 8, it could be 9, it could be 10, pertaining to the handwriting that you are writing. So it means now, learners, what are we talking about? What am I saying to you right now here? I'm saying to you, learners, that your content is what is actually critical here. Because the more content you provide, now take note, the content must be relevant and it must be factual material. So your content is not what you think, what you imagine, or the sources. No. That's not a content. The content, it is basically material that you have studied. It is material. It's an essay that you created for yourself in your writing book, basically. Now that content must be in line. It must be a line of argument, and that line of argument must have the Peel method. Now take note, like I said, it's not 1, 2 paragraphs, it is paragraphs. So it could be 7, 8, 9, 10. Now take note, I'm starting with 7 because the factual information is not one paragraph. Now take note, learners, that when we write our body, we need to keep the main ideas in one paragraph. So if you are writing now basically about Malcolm X, in the one paragraph, it must only contain Malcolm X unless the information is too much. Now you move over to the next paragraph. It's always advisable to keep our paragraph short. Why? Because if it's short, it's more meaningful with regards to that. Now take note that when you provide a line of argument, the Peel method must be there. Now let's quickly go into what is the Peel method basically. And the Peel method is basically how you should sustain your line of argument. Now, let's quickly go into the P. What is the P? Point. The candidate introduces the essay by taking a line of argument. Making a point is the starting point, basically. And this is why we say a point, because it's the starting point. Each paragraph should include a point that sustains the major point line of argument. It was made in the introduction. So now again, we are moving. If you're making a point, for instance, we are introducing basically, let's use the Vietnam essay. basically. We are saying that Lyndon Johnson became president and the viewpoint of the Americans changed towards the war. So we are talking about the war in Vietnam, because the question is talking about how a small country, how a small nation like Vietnam defeated a giant nation like the USA. So now our point is about the war. So now when I go to the first E talks about you must explain it. The candidate should explain in more detail what the main point is about and how it relates to the question. And now it means now we say, now the point that we made is that Lyndon Johnson became president and the viewpoint of America changed towards the war in South Vietnam. Now we need to explain it. Johnson believed that the only way for them to win this war is to send more troops to South Vietnam. You see, now we explain our point now. But now the next it talks about examples. So now we need to provide an example. The candidate should answer the question by selecting content that is relevant to the line of argument. Relevant examples should be given to sustain what? The line of argument. So now we move, now we give an example. Lyndon Johnson ensured that by 1967, yes, there must be more than 500,000 troops in South Vietnam. You see, now we're explaining that. Why he said they must populate South Vietnam. Now we indicate to them that the amount of troops that is basically sent. Then we need to link it now back. Then we indicate, we continue with the example. Before we go to the linking back, we must continue with the example. So now we indicate he started off with Operation Range, and then the first thing that he started doing was Operation Rolling Thunder, where he tried to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail, that was the supply line into South Vietnam. So what are we doing? We are basically now give an example what he was trying to do, how he was trying to populate it basically. Then we go now to the linkage part. So when we talk about the linkage part, now the linking part means candidates should ensure that the line of argument is sustained throughout the essay and is written coherently. Now this is what happens. Learners struggle to link it back now. So now we indicate, because Lyndon Johnson, the first thing that he was trying to do, he was trying to populate South Vietnam with American troops. So what did he do? He started bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Then we need to continue now by linking it back. He could not deliver a knockout blow. Why? Because the Ho Chi Minh was not only on top of the soil, but the Ho Chi Minh was also underground through tunnels basically. And that made it difficult for them to deliver a knockout blow on the Vietcong basically, and on Vietman. So now we can clearly see now the P means point, the first E explanation, the second E examples that must be provided, and then link it back. Now learners, what happens at times is that sometimes the one point is too long. So it's always best to keep your points in one paragraph. Why? Because then you can express the Peel method better. You can explain your essay better basically. Then when we go to the link it part, you link it now back to the question, because remember now the question that was posed is that how come a small nation like Vietnam defeated a giant nation like the USA? So I've given you an example how it should be. When we go through the content, I have prepared a paragraph, and I'll show you pertaining to the topic that we are dealing with. So we'll just deal with one paragraph pertaining to that topic. Now take note now, learners, after your paragraph has been written now it is pertinent that we understand, after the paragraph has been written, you start with your introduction, background paragraph, content. So you've written all your content paragraphs, which is your body now. What happens is now you must move into the conclusion. Now I've given you an example how a conclusion should look like, more or less. Now take note, it is not supposed to look like this precisely. All I did is I just created a sample in order to guide you along. Now let's look at the conclusion that was provided here. Let me read it to you quickly. In conclusion, to a great extent, Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael instilled black pride in African Americans in the 1960s. It emphasized racial pride, economic empowerment, and the creation of political and cultural institutions. They created an African American into believe that they need to be proud to be black. So now we can clearly see the first sentence informs us that we are doing what? We are ending off our essay. Now take note, uh, there are various ways how we inform any reader that we are ending the essay. How do we inform them? We can say by tying up my essay, in conclusion to my essay, by ending off my essay. So there are various things that we are using to show that we are ending off our essay. But take note, we went back to the introduction and we used again to a great extent. Now it is pertinent that we understand that we need to go back to the introduction, go fetch our stance that we took, and then we include it in the conclusion. Now take note, we even use the question that was actually given unto us. And Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael instilled black pride in African Americans. Now learners, it's a clear indication that we went back to the introduction. Yes, we are ending it off, so we showing that we're ending off in tying, in ending, by summing up my essay. Now those are the wordings that should be used in the conclusion basically. Then we went back, we took our stance to re-emphasize that we are ending and how we are going to end. And we use the same examples. Take note, learners, we use the same examples that was used in the introduction, and we use it where? In the conclusion. But take note, they created an African American in believing that they need to be proud to be black. So now the last sentence is an indication. Listen here, this is how I am ending my essay basically. Now, learners, please take note now. We started off by emphasizing what does a proper essay require you to have. We started off by introducing you to what? To the introduction. When we spoke about the introduction, we spoke about the three things that are supposed to be. We spoke about number one, the stance that you must take. Then after the stance, we spoke about reason that you must introduce. Reason is the content that will be in your essay now. Then we spoke about what the essay will be informing us about. Now take note. Then thereafter, we spoke about the three levels of the questions that will be provided. We spoke about critically discuss. We spoke about do you agree? Now take note, critically discuss, do you agree? They always provide you first with the statement, and after providing you with the statement, now they come in critically discuss. Now they come in, do you agree? Then we spoke about to what extent. Now take note, I showed you an example that you cannot say one can agree to a great extent. You can't say that. Why? Because it's three different questions that's being posed to you. We showed you that. I will show you again the same example later when we are dealing with the content within itself also. Then we spoke about the background paragraph that is important, that is the basis where we move into what? Into the body. And then when we move into the body, it is a clear indication, learners, that the body is not one, two, three paragraphs, but it is different paragraphs that you should know the content. Take note, you cannot rewrite the sources because you will receive no marks for that. No marks will be allocated if you write the sources down. Then we spoke about listen learners that you must have a proper conclusion, and here you can clearly see on the screen that this is a proper conclusion, and I've given you examples how your conclusion should look like. Learners, let us quickly go for a break. When we come back, we'll be moving into the content of this essay.
I want you to ask yourself these three questions. Number one, what do I want? Do I want to become an A student or do I want to become an average student? Number two, I want you to ask yourself, how do you plan on getting there? Are you going to put more extra hours or are you going to just sleep? Number three, who will be with you in this journey? Because it is important that we associate ourselves with students who have the same vision as us, who want to become a student, who want to put in the extra work, who want to become better at what they do. Unsuccessful people do not plan, they just let life happen to them. But successful people are planning on how they want their lives to be. And right now, you plan on how you want your results at the end of the year to be like.
Good day, grade 12 learners. Welcome to today's history lesson. My name is Mr. Dixon. This lesson is brought to you by the Gauteng Department of Education in collaboration with Sabono Discovery. Now, let me just emphasize quickly, learners, that we need to understand that we have been dealing with in the first session what we call basically the structure of a essay, how a essay should look like. Now take note, when we talk about how the essay should look like, we talk about the structure. And what is the structure? There must be introduction, there must be a body, take note, and a body is a couple of paragraphs, then there must be a conclusion. That is basically the structure. We went further into detail by saying that in the introduction, there must be 3 phases. The first one that we spoke about is your stance that you take. We spoke about one can agree, one can disagree. We spoke about one can approve, one can disapprove. We spoke about to a less extent, to a great extent. And remember, when we said to a greater extent, we said you can utilize to a larger extent also. Then we went into the body and we spoke about appeal method that must be maintained, the line of argument that was created where in the introduction. Then we went lastly to the conclusion and we indicated you must inform us that you are actually ending off this particular essay. This is what we did. Then we said you retrieve your stance that you took in the introduction and you bring it where? Into the conclusion now. Then you use the same thing that you use in the introduction, like the reasoning, is what you must put in the conclusion. But then you end it off with a different sentence that also shows us that you have answered this particular question. Now let's quickly go into the content pertaining to Black Power. Now please take note. We have dealt with topic 1. Topic 1 is the Cold War, the origin of the Cold War, which includes, now the origin of the Cold War is the source base, which is question 1. Then question 2 in the source base is Angola. Question 3 is civil rights movement. Then when you move into section B, the first essay question is question 4, which is Vietnam. The second question is Congo. The last one is question 6, which is Black Power movement. And this is what we are going to do now. We are going into the content, what should be in your essay. So we are just going to highlight to you that this is supposed to be in the content of this particular essay. Now, meaning now there are more things that should be there, and your teacher is the one that must inform you about the other stuff that must be in here, because we are just talking about the main points that should be in the essay. Now, before we start off, let us quickly go to what we call the examination bullets, our exam guidelines, and this informs us what should be in there. Reasons, first of all, reasons for the Black Power movement, formation of the Black Panther Party, roles of Stokely Carmichael, Malcolm X, and others. Take note, when we talk about others, we are talking about James Meredith, we are talking about Elijah Muhammad. Those are others basically. And there were other role players also that was part and parcel of the Black Panther also. Then we will have to look at the short-term goals and the long-term gains basically. So now we can clearly see the 4 bullets must be covered. And this is what we call now, what we call the origin of, now when we talk about the 4 bullets, we are talking about these are the points that must be covered. It must be where? In the essay. We cannot deviate from this here. So we can clearly see that the civil rights is not in this essay. So it means now it must cover what we call the Black Power movement. Now let's quickly go into the example that we used earlier. Let's utilize the question it was posed to us. Explain to what extent Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael were successful in instilling black pride amongst African Americans in the 1960s. So this is the question being posed. So the content that we are going to deal with must answer the question that's being posed. Now let's look again at the example of the introduction that was introduced to us in the first session. To a great extent, Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael were successful in instilling black pride among African Americans in the 1960s. It emphasized racial pride, economic empowerment, and the creation of political and cultural institutions. The following paragraphs will be explaining how Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael instilled black pride in African Americans. So now we can clearly see that our introduction has already guided us what should be in the essay. Now let's first go to, this is what we are going to deal. This is now what we call background knowledge that we are dealing with. Now before we start off, we need to understand before the civil rights movement, before the Black Power was the civil rights movement. Now let us not get confused. The civil rights movement was started by who? By the by the Rosa Parks incident, and who was the leader of the civil rights? Martin Luther King. Now take note. You will notice as we go along here that Malcolm X was not the leader of the Black Power movement, but it was a group of people. But we'll deal with that now. Let's first get our basis right. So this is why your teacher first did civil rights movement, then the teacher moved into Black Power movement as such. Now the goal of the Black Power movement was to empower and create a strong racial identity for African Americans. It glorified shared qualities such as dialect. What is dialect? Dialect means the language you speak, the sound that you make. Physical attributes, how you look physically, and history. Black Power encouraged a separate development from white society, basically, saying black people should write their own history from their own institutions like credit unions and political parties. When we talk about credit unions, we're talking about banks, basically. But very pertinent that our second point, it should glorify shared qualities such as physical attributes. So when we talk about physical attributes, the Black Power believed that black is beautiful, because during that period you had to be white in order to become pretty. But here the Black Power came and said, listen here, black is beautiful, basically. Now we are just dealing with the basis with that also. Then let's go into further detail there. The Black Power is, they were basically very controversial. Why? Because it was considered anti-white, but it acknowledged that some white people had helped African Americans to secure the rights to vote, organize, protest, and hand out leaflets at such also. Now take note. Let us go back now. Let's talk about the second point. When we go back to the civil rights movement, clearly when we were dealing with the topics, for instance, when we were dealing with the Montgomery bus boycott, we saw in the photographs that white clergymen, they supported Martin Luther King also. When we go to the sit-ins, we can clearly see that white people supported African Americans also. When we go to the freedom rights, it talks about the freedom rights, says 13 multiracial students, they contributed to that. Now we need to understand that with the civil rights movement, they allowed different races to support, but the Black Power movement only wanted white people to support them. Then that was now what we said was controversial, basically. But now in the 1960s, it is a time for black people to fight for themselves, because they believe, now listen here, the white people have been fighting on our behalf. So they believe it's time for black people to fight for themselves. It was also important to African Americans that to create a sense of self-worth at the time, so that justice could be sought and oppression to be fight against without the assistance of white people. It means that they believe, listen here, we black people have got the power and the ability and the intellect to fight for ourselves. Now, boys and girls, it is pertinent that why did the Black Power movement now come to the forefront? African Americans also needed an environment to express their frustration with the current system of oppression. According to the philosophy of Black Power, this environment could not exist in the presence of white parties. Why? Because it was long overdue. The Black Power movement believed that, listen here, white people were not helping them. White people could not assist them. And even the government could not assist them at that point in time. But what we need to understand at this point in time, although the Civil Rights Act was signed, now take note, although the Civil Rights Act was signed, it clearly meant that, listen here, African Americans were still oppressed. Although, take note, although the Rights Act was signed, African Americans were still oppressed. So the Civil Rights Act clearly meant that no segregation. Now take note, in the 13 southern states of the USA, they had segregation laws still, the Jim Crow laws. And through the Civil Rights Act, most of those laws were abolished, but still people were oppressed. Were oppressed. African Americans live far. Now take note, we are still dealing with the background knowledge. African Americans live far from where? From the workplaces. There were a high mortality rate amongst African Americans. When we talk about high mortality rate, it means a lot of African Americans were murdered, basically. At the same time, they had inadequate housing, they had inadequate education, and for that reason, they felt that white people were not supporting them in the fight against segregation in the United States of America. So, learners, what did we do now? I explained to you what we call the background paragraphs. So now we can clearly see it's two separate background paragraphs, because why? We talk about the reasons for the Black Power movement and why the Black Power movement was needed. So the Black Power movement was needed because African Americans believed that the civil rights movement was too slow to bring change for African Americans. Although through the civil rights movement, the Civil Rights Act was signed, banning all segregation within America as a country. Then the Voters' Rights Act was also signed. Then unbanning public places, that was dealt through the civil rights movement. What we also need to understand is that the civil rights movement was basically what we call, it was a passive resistance, meaning there was no violence in the civil rights movement. But when the Black Power movement came, they believed in taking it more a step further. And when we say a step further, it means they believed in becoming aggressive towards what was happening. But let's go to the person that introduced the Black Power movement to the African American people. We can clearly see on the screen there's a photo, and this photo is Martin Luther King with the glasses, and next to him is a guy by the name of Stokely Carmichael. Now, it is imperative that Stokely Carmichael went to Howard University, and he became a leader of the Nonviolent Action Group. Now, the Nonviolent Action Group were the people that were the instigators to the freedom rights. Now, Carmichael brought NAG into, now NAG is a Nonviolent Action Group. Carmichael brought NAG into affiliation with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and took part in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee Freedom Rights of 1961. So now we can clearly see that Stokely Carmichael started off with a civil rights movement. So this is a clear indication it was first the civil rights, then the Black Power movement afterwards. Carmichael later became a field organizer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and lead voter registration. And he was the leader within the voter registration drive in Mississippi in 1966. He was also selected as the chairperson of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Then, what transpired is, learners, we need to understand now. James Meredith, take note, I've mentioned his name earlier, James Meredith. James Meredith was the first African American that was enrolled in a white-only universities. Now, in the United States of America, we find two types of universities in each state. Now, take note, there are 50 states in the United States of America. When we talk about states, in the United States of America, we're talking about provinces. In South Africa, yes, South Africa has got 9 provinces. In the United States, we have 50 states. Now, within each state, there are 2 universities. The first university was for white people, and the second one was for African Americans. But now it has changed. If you're white, you can go to the African American University, but we're talking about in the time of segregation within the United States. So what happened is James Meredith became the first African American who was enrolled at a white-only university. James Meredith went on a protest with a group of people in Jackson, Mississippi. They shot him, and Martin Luther King and Stokely Carmichael heard about what happened. They went and they completed the march. After the march, Stokely Carmichael was arrested, and after his release from prison on 16 June 1966, he made his famous speech. And what was the famous speech? Black power. It means black people in this country should unite. And this is what he was saying. He named his speech Black Power, and he said black people in this country should unite to recognize their heritage and to build a sense of community, form and lead their own organizations, rejected the values of American society. So when we look at this, what he said in his speech, isn't this what was in the introduction? Yes, we spoke about that they were building, that they instilled pride by doing what? By building organizations within the African American fraternity, basically. So now we can clearly see what's in the introduction. It is now in the content, because why? We are looking at explain how Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael instilled black pride in African Americans. So now we can clearly see what was said in his speech. It's what was utilized in the introduction. Then it continues. It says in 1967 he joined with Charles V. Hamilton to write the book Black Power: The Politics of Liberation in America. So, ladies and gentlemen, now we can clearly see now that Stokely Carmichael now believed that the civil rights movement was too slow. Because why? People were getting injured, people were getting beaten up by the police, people were even getting beaten up by white supremacist groups. When we talk about white supremacist groups, we are talking about the Ku Klux Klan, basically. And when we talk about the Ku Klux Klan, that was a organization of only white people that fought against African Americans receiving their rights within the United States of America. Now let's continue with Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael adopted a slogan of Black is beautiful, Black pride, and he rejected white ideas on beauty, basically. Because what happened is that on adverts you would only see white people and no African American. And what happened is African Americans thought within themselves, listen here, it is best to be a white person. But what Stokely Carmichael believed in, no, he believed in black is beautiful. And this included basically that as you can see on the photograph on the screen, African African Americans should wear afros, and this is where afros now became famous within the world as such also. And when you look at the ladies' dress code, he believed that African Americans should dress like Africans. So it means now, what did Stokely Carmichael do? He reminded the African Americans where they are coming from, and that was creating pride within African Americans. He believed that if you knew where you came from, then you can become a better person at the end of the day, instead of adopting someone else's culture, someone else's heritage within itself also. Now we need to understand that Stokely Carmichael was also a leader within the civil rights movement. And we can clearly see on the picture here is Stokely Carmichael standing with some of the African Americans that was with him also. Now, some leaders of the civil rights group, such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, rejected Carmichael's ideas and accused him of racist. Now, why did they reject that? Because Stokely Carmichael, after he came out of prison and he had his speech on black power, then he believed that, listen here, this passive resistance of Martin Luther King is not going to work. So he now adopted what we call an aggressive stance. So it means when there are protests, they must become aggressive towards the police. They must become aggressive towards what they want to achieve. So Carmichael now began to criticize his friend Martin Luther King and his ideologies of non-violence. So it means now Carmichael did not become the enemy of Martin Luther King. He was only disagreeing with the non-violent approach of Martin Luther King. Because a lot of people say they became enemies. No, no, no. He was just upfront and he criticized him. Listen here, these non-violent strategies are not working for African Americans, because look what happened to James Meredith. Then what happened is Stokely Carmichael now, but we will deal with what we are going to talk about now. He eventually joined the Black Panther Party, and we can see uh, how he's surrounded by the members of the Black Panther Party as such also. So who was the Black Panther Party? We will talk about that later. So now everyone is aware now that Stokely Carmichael is the one that came up with the idea. Now take note, the Black Power movement, it's an ideology, it's an idea, it is not a political organization, because a lot of people think that the Black Power movement was a political organization. No, learners, the Black Power movement was an ideology, an idea that was introduced by who? Stokely Carmichael. Now take note, a lot of people say that Malcolm X was the one that's, no, 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 now you can clearly see who started the Black Power movement. Stokely Carmichael. Now let's move into the Black Panther Party. Who was the Black Panther Party? Now I have created a paragraph in order for you to see how you should actually create your peel method. Let's look at the point that's introduced. The Black Panther Party was formed by Bobby Searle and Huey Newton. So now what are we doing? Our point is the Black Panther Party. Now let's go to how we're explaining it. They were involved in initiating and supporting community-based programs. Can you see? Linking us back to the introduction. They were supporting community-based programs and feeding schemes, as well as anti-poverty centers. Now let's go into the examples that are being introduced here. For defense against police brutality, focus on social economic conditions of African Americans, and also operated community survival programs. Now you see, that's one sentence. Now let's move into the next sentence. The Black Panther Party got involved in street patrols, monitoring police activities, and defended themselves by carrying guns. Militant approach. Now we can see that the violence came in here. They had guns and they were using, whereby the civil rights movement didn't have guns, to stop the ongoing police brutality and harassment of young urban black men. Now we need to link it back to the question being posed. It is clear that the Black Panther Party created self-esteem within the Black African community by the programs that they introduced, basically. So now we have a clear understanding who the Black Panther Party was. They was basically created to do what? To protect African Americans. But the Black Panther Party also had what we call a 10-point program system. Now learners, that 10-point program system was what created suspicion amongst the FBI, basically. So the 10-point program, basically, learners, was it was feeding schemes before and after school. It was tuition programs after school. It means aftercare facilities. It was where they created medical facilities for African American, where they created clinics where women should go for prenatal care. When we talk about prenatal care, when they were pregnant, you go for prenatal care. It means women were now examined and they were informed, listen, you are pregnant for this amount, and where women went for treatment at the same time also. But the 10-point program that attracted the FBI now was what we call what we call socialism. Socialism is linked to communism, basically, where they wanted to be treated equally as the Caucasians. Why I'm using the word Caucasians? Because it's a word used currently in America for white people, basically. So they wanted socialism, and communist principles were adopted also through that also. And because some of the members of the Black Panther Party, they were very vocal that they are in support of communism, because at the same time America was involved in the Vietnam War. So now we can clearly see that how closely linked the Black Power was to the not to the Vietnam War also, because they believe that African Americans must not be part of this war, because this is a war where that was fought by white people against a different type of individual, basically. So they believe African Americans mustn't be part of this war. And because of that, the FBI had what we call close surveillance on the Black Panther Party. They believe that the Black Panther Party could have been set up by, now by who? By the communists to dethrone the current government within the USA. And for that reason, the FBI had close surveillance. Now take note, the leader of the Black Panther Party, he was even arrested because he was accused of killing or shooting a policeman, and clearly on the trial, the Black Panther Party members, they became evident during that whole process. So now we can clearly see now Stokely Carmichael started this whole idea of the Black Panther Party. It moved from there, where he now joined the Black Panther Party. Now take note, he started the Black Power movement, the ideology. Then he joined the Black Panther Party. Now we can clearly see Bobby Searle, Huey Newton, they were the founders of the Black Panther Party. Yes, this is not the Black Panther Party that you will see on the movies, but the Black Panther movie, it was derived from this system within itself. Now let's move over to other role players within the within the Black Power movement. So now we can clearly see that the Black Panther Party was a political organization created to protect African Americans, to look after the well-being of African Americans, and they did not want to be part of the white society. Then another role player is Elijah Muhammad. Now, who was Elijah Muhammad? Elijah Muhammad, he was basically the founder member of what we would call the Nation of Islam. Now, his belief system was based on the ideas of Marcus Garvey, the new Negro, basically. Now, Elijah Muhammad worked to uplift impoverished blacks by fostering a sense of black pride. That was his first stance where he started. The main aim was to uplift black people from being poor. He operated shops and restaurants to promote economic independence. So he created within the ideas, let's create our own shops, let's create our own restaurants to do what? To create economic independence. They believe that white people must not have shops or restaurants within the black community. Apology. They believe that African Americans should develop their own economic system within their own community. They also believe that African Americans were not allowed to have their own economy within the white society. Then he stressed and appreciated that black people must have their own black culture roots. Then he also saw white people as the enemy, and he called them the blue-eyed devils, and therefore rejected calls for white integration with black people. Then the Nation of Islam continued to spread throughout the United States, especially within the eastern part of the United States in the 1950s. Another role player that was part and parcel of the Black Power movement is the person by the name of Malcolm X. So in 1946, Malcolm Little, before he was called Malcolm X, his name was Malcolm Little. Malcolm Little was arrested for theft and breaking in and entry in February, on the 27th of February 1946. He entered Charleston State Prison at the age of 20. Malcolm X was transferred in 1948 to an experimental and progressive prison program in Massachusetts. The Norfolk prison colony gave greater freedom to its inmates and had an excellent library, and Malcolm X began to read a lot. Take note, Malcolm Little went to prison, uneducated, came to prison, and he started reading a lot. And this is now where he adopted the belief system that, listen here, the surname Little was given by white people to his forefathers, and he denounced that. And when he left prison, he became known as Malcolm X, basically. Now, Malcolm X had this belief system. He had a belief system that he was classified as the intellectual father of the Black Power movement. Why? Because he had this within himself. He believed in self defense, that African Americans must defend themselves instead of non violence. He believed in black nationalism instead of non racialism. It means he did not want integration. Then he insisted in black separatism instead of integration, within itself, integration or desegregation. He believed in a revolution instead of reform. When we talk about a revolution can be passive, it can be aggressive. So he believed that revolution needs to take place as quickly as possible. And he was a very eloquent speaker because of him reading. So now we can see, learners, because through his reading, he became intellectual. So it means now, in order for any individual to become an intellect, you must become a reader. But during that process, he had some speeches that he made, and I'll be mentioning three of them. By any means necessary, bullet or the ballot. So when we talk about bullet or the ballot, he encouraged African Americans to go and vote in order not to be shot at by the police, because he believed if you go and vote, we might change the whole situation where African Americans found themselves. Then the last bullet, speech on police brutality. He criticized police in public, how evil they were against African Americans. Now it is pertinent that Stokely Carmichael, Elijah Muhammad, at the same time, uh, Malcolm X were not the only role players during the Black Power movement, but Angela Davis was also one of the people that was in the forefront. Now, who was Angela Davis? Angela Davis was a radical African American educator and an activist for civil rights. So we need to understand that part. That she was an educator. Yes, she was a lecturer at the university, and she was an activist for civil rights within the African American society. Then she believed in also basically that African Americans should fight for themselves, organize interracial studies with different groups also, which was broken up by the police. Then later on in 1960, she joined the Black Panther Party. Later on, she was also charged with aiding escape or on attempt of George Jackson. And then she was also basically she was accused that she was the one that assisted him in aiding him to escape from prison by giving him a gun at the same time also. And Angela Davis became the one of the most wanted ladies within the United States of America. Now, learners, I have mentioned to you the origins of the reasons why the Black Power was started. I mentioned the role players to you. At the same time, as I mentioned the role players to you, it came about that Martin Luther King was not part of the Black Power movement, but Stokely Carmichael was friends with Martin Luther King, left the civil rights movement. Then he started the idea, the concept of the Black Power movement. From there, the Black Power movement, the Black Panther was started, the Nation of Islam was started, and those people ran with the idea of the Black Power movement, basically. Angela Davis was the last one that we spoke about. And what we need to understand is after the assassination of Malcolm X, there was riots in the northern part of America, particularly in the area called Watts. And that riots actually lasted for 4 summers. Now, when we say 4 summers, we're talking about 4 years, basically. We need to understand that President Johnson at that point in time was immense under pressure because it was the war in Vietnam. At the same time, it was the violence that started in Watts, basically. And President Johnson appointed a commission, and this commission investigated the violence. Why are the people in uproar in the northern part of America? Then the investigating committee came to the conclusion that African Americans were fighting because of poor housing conditions, lack of jobs, lack of education, and inadequate transport within their own environment also. So what happened is President Johnson now, and this is now we are moving now to the short term and the long term gains. So President Johnson, what did he do? He began to uh, reinvent certain things, meaning houses were improved for African Americans. Uh, they were no longer hired first, hired last, fired first, basically. That began to change. They created institutions for them, like the different universities. And because of those universities that was being created, the lives of African Americans began to improve. So this is why the Black Power began what we would call a revolutionary movement in the 1960s and 1970s. It emphasized racial pride, economic empowerment, and the creation of political and cultural institutions. So now we can clearly see that this was in the introduction and it was also in the conclusion, basically. Now, learners, it is basically clear that the short term and the long term gains was basically African Americans' lives improve, basically. And this brings us now basically to our conclusion. Basically, it brings us to the end of our session. So now we can clearly see that the question that was posed explained to what extent Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael instilled black pride in African Americans in the 1960s. So now we went to the content and we retrieved from the content. And what did we do? We said it emphasized racial pride, economic empowerment, and the creation of political and cultural institutions. So when we look at emphasize racial pride, did not Stokely Carmichael emphasize that black people must be proud of their heritage? Did not now Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam believed in the roots of African Americans? Yes. Did they create economic empowerment? Yes. They created their own businesses amongst the Black Power movement by introducing the Black Panther Party and the Nation of Islam. They created political organizations, Black Panther Party, Nation of Islam. They introduced cultural institutions, meaning universities only for black students within itself. And that in itself, learners, informs us now that this is what should be in the content. So learners, once you have this in the content and your introduction is excellent, there is background that creates the basis, and every paragraph has got the Peel method. And I've given you an example how the Peel method should be introduced. I've created to you a line of argument, and I've created you how you should maintain your line of argument, but throughout the essay, basically. And that's a clear indication, learners, that's how your essay should be. But what did we do today? We just created the basis of the content that you should have within your essay. Learners, thank you for watching this lesson and see you next time.